Hey everyone and welcome to Squidly Bits, our second channel packed with painting tutorials and tips and tricks. And today, like once every month, we are going to show you how you can improve your paint jobs by using some of the minis posted by our patrons or on our Patreon community. Let's not waste any more time. Let's hop into it and start with the first paint job of today with this Iron Man bust painted by Ed. So it's been a real treat following along with Ed's journey because he's really improved over the past couple of months when he started sending us some of his minis, and you can really tell in this mini that he's really starting to get it. There's a few things, however, that we can discuss and talk about, and I'm gonna be quite quick about it because he's already on a really high level and we just want to cover some of those high-end things that he might have missed or not thought about. So the first one that I kind of want to cover is the amount of really bright highlights. So if you want to have like a more moody paint job, which, you know, to be fair, maybe he doesn't, I don't like using this large area that is white. I prefer like bringing it down a little bit, so we have slightly less large areas that are punched to like the brightest highlights. So we bring it down a little bit. Maybe we take this shadow tone and increase its area slight bit, and then we bring in a little bit more of this mid-tone to some of these areas. And as opposed to having maybe white down here, maybe it would be nice to have like a more yellowy tone. So something like this to make it feel more like gold and reflect a more goldy tone. Overall, the highlighting on this one is really good. So this is more about style choices maybe rather than actual like improvement. So just keep that in mind when we talk about this paint job. But yeah, bring in a little bit more of the shadow tone, blend it in a little bit like this. If we want to have a little bit more of a secondary reflection, of course we could like punch this highlight a little bit more, make it go all the way up a little bit. But again, stylistic choice, it's already good as is. To me, it's more about like the white is a little bit too strong, so we bring that down a little bit. In this photo, the paint job is a little bit too cold yellow. I think that might be the photo rather than the actual color choices. But I'm gonna bring in a little bit of orange to it to kind of show that it's gonna read a little bit more like a shiny gold when it has a little bit more saturation maybe than some of the colors used today, or at least shown in the photo. So small changes again. Just look at blazing in with orange after you're done with the paint job versus the original. So small changes, but still looking good. The last thing that I would like to cover is that gold can still reflect the colors around it a little bit. So if I were to maybe enter this piece into a painting competition, I would probably glaze in a little bit of a reflection in the shadow tones here, closest to the gold, just to have a little bit of that red kind of shine through. As you can see, I'm adding just a tiny bit and it's barely visible on the screen. But it does make it feel like the gold and the red is part of the same environment because it's reflecting each other's colors. So it's small things. But as I've said, Ed, you should be super proud of this paint job. You've improved a ton. So I look forward to seeing more of these pieces. But now let's hop on to the next one. So this miniature is painted by KRS Boss. And he's painting this miniature for a painting competition. So he wants to have like the high-end feedback on the miniature. He wants me to really slap him on the fingers if he's done a bad job. And so we will. As you guys probably already can see on this paint job, it's already a really good paint job. Like he's done non-metallic metal. He's taken a lot of time to do the light placement really well, which is really nice to see. There's a few things maybe that I would like to clean up if I'm entering it for a painting competition. The first one that sticks out to me a little bit is this highlight here on the robe. And as you can see, it's kind of going from shadow tone to highlight to mid-tone to highlight to shadow to the colors aren't really filled out on the area. So it does feel a little bit messy. If we would just fill out these highlights to make sure that we have like a full coverage between every layer and make smooth transitions like this, we can hop in with a little bit more orange. And then we bring in that final highlight that it had a bit more of like an orange. You can see that it just reads a little bit more clean than the original paint job. So if we look at the before and the after, Maybe he doesn't want to have this like strong highlight or whatever, but just making it a little bit more clean and making sure that you have smooth transitions between every layer really does a ton for a painting competition if you have that like extra detail put into it. So the second thing that I kind of want to cover is the steel that he has done. And the armor up here on the chest piece I think looks really good. Like he's done a good way of placing the highlight. It does look reflective. It's really nice. Maybe we can punch some of these areas up here just to bring the highlight up a little bit more in terms of contrast, but also a very personal thing. However, when we come to this side here, I assume this is the same type of metal. So it's a steel or, a metal armor. And right now it's just edge highlighted, which means that it doesn't read as reflective. What we want to do is we want to create a highlight that goes across each one of these cylindrical shapes. So if we do like this, we can even add a secondary one. Maybe one on the edge. And then we add in a little bit of that final reflective highlight as well. Something like this on one of them. We leave the other one a little bit less reflective. So just bringing in a little bit of a highlight, something like this. If we want to punch the very top of it, I prefer going in with like a sun yellow because it contrasts really well when you're doing a metal armor. You can just bring in a little bit of that to add some reflectiveness on some of these areas to make it pop a little bit more, feel a little bit more reflective. So if we zoom out now, you can see that the armor on the arm looks a little bit more reflective and it feels like it belongs more with the armor parts around the chest. Lastly, the thing that I would like to talk about, and this is also something that's going to show up in the last miniature in this video, and that is the color of the gold. We have a very mustardy yellow for our mid-tone for the gold. I do like the shadow tone. It's kind of nice. It's like a dark brown. And I've mentioned this, I don't know how many times when we do these critiques. That like a mustardy yellow feels more like khaki, and then it goes up to a very yellowy yellow, so it's like a moon yellow or something. It's quite cold, and then to the final ivory. Personally, these colors to me, it can read like gold, but then you have to be almost perfect with your placements. Instead, we want to have a little bit more of an orangey brown in there. So I start with like a really, really dark, deep brown, like a burnt umber, or in our case, we have dark rust in our paint sets, and that's our favorite colors for this type of stuff. Then we use a bit more of an orange brown tones. The color that we use in our paint set is called Parasite Brown, and I think that's a really nice tone. As you can see, this one is more khaki, this one is more orange brown. Then we start mixing in a little bit of ice yellow to that mix to make it pop in the highlight. But we want our mid-tones to be a bit more orangey. And then for our final steps, we bring in just a tiny bit of ice yellow to pop the highlight. And as you can see when we zoom out of this, when you have like a perfect reflection, when you place the highlight perfectly fine, both of them look quite nice. But when you start getting like on your mini, you're painting for the first time gold, and you don't have 100% perfectly placed highlights, it is better to use colors that are a little bit more warm, has a little bit more orange to it. I think that's going to help you a big way to make this armor pop a little bit more. And maybe have bigger surfaces that are the mid-tone. So from our paint set, as I said, Parasite Brown is a really good color to cover like 80-90% of the gold. And then you just start adding in a little bit more of the ice yellow and maybe glaze in a little bit of yellow in the top highlights. But color selections, super important. Fixing the highlights a little bit more so it's a little bit more smooth. And with that, I think you should be good to enter this into a competition. Might be a little bit of rework. That's my suggestions to start with. If you want more tips, you can just send in another mini for next month's feedback. The third one that we have for this week's video is a miniature from Heresy, and he said that he wanted tips on two things. He wanted some tips on volumetric highlighting, which I understand. The other one was a little bit about the composition. The main thing that I'm going to focus on today is the composition for the piece, because generally Chaos, especially from the fantasy line, is just overly detailed and does not have a lot of like easy and natural to understand surfaces that makes it easy for me to teach you how to paint with volumes. But I'm going to show you on one thing just to give you something to think about, and that is that every surface that is angled slightly upwards should be highlighted. So I can see that you've done that on this top raised edge here on these armor pieces. They are highlighted more than down here below, which is great. However, when we come down to the armor down here, you can see that you've made it almost all black. Instead, any angle like this that is angled slightly upwards, we want to make sure that that is highlighted, at least with our mid-tone. And preferably, if we can, maybe even highlight these areas a tiny bit more with maybe a first set of highlights. And then, of course, the further down we get, the less of this highlight we add. So maybe down here we wouldn't be adding as large surface of the highlight color as we would on these top parts that are up here. That's just the first thing. Like, look at the panel or look at the surface of the miniature. Is it angled upwards? If yes, then boom, put in a little bit more of a highlight before and after. You can see small changes, but it does make a little bit more sense. But let's talk about the composition, because that is something that I find to be really important and super interesting. For a piece like this, when you just have one miniature and you put him on a really big base like you've done today, it's really difficult to create an interesting composition. If you're doing a vignette, you kind of want the piece to shrink in a little bit more on the miniature, maybe even have the plinth be slightly smaller than the miniature. Whereas in this case, the base is what is taking up most of the space and like taking most of the focus. You want the miniature to be the focal point. So instead of having it going down this far and having it going down all the way outside of where the miniature is, maybe it would be nicer if we kind of prop in quite a lot actually. We can kind of, maybe if we do something like this. So if you just look at this piece now in a void, how much more interesting the piece starts looking, just because it's more focused on the miniature as opposed to, you know, the background. So here we have it. We've shrunken everything in. We made the composition a little bit more interesting. You have parts of the diorama, maybe the tree coming out from up top of it. You have the tail of the dragon coming out on the back. You have the horns sticking out in the front. Small things like this, just changing the size of the plinth, makes a huge difference for the miniature's composition. And when you enter a painting competition, it's really something that you'd think about. If every part of the base doesn't live up to the same standard as the paint job, you're screwed. Everything needs to be to the same level of the paint job. And the smaller the base is, the more you can focus on making a nice pose, a dynamic pose of the miniature. You don't have to worry about all the dead space and how that interacts with the character. It's shrinking down the scene, making it smaller, and putting a ton of effort into that small area. It's gonna make it look a ton better. And lastly, we have one more miniature. This one is from Valentin, and he has done a really big paint job with a ton of non-metallic metal, and he's done some really cool placements of the highlights. But just like with the last miniature that was painted for a painting competition, where the gold colors was a little bit off, this one has that same problem. Here, instead of it being really khaki, it has a very mustard yellowy tone. And we have pretty much every area of the miniature all the way down highlighted to the same level, which means that we barely have any mid-tones, we barely have any shadows, it's all highlights. So as I've mentioned, my favorite colors for painting gold is dark rust, parasite brown, mixing in some ice yellow, and if you want to, you can glaze a little bit of sun yellow in there. It's gonna make a massive difference. And the second thing, as I mentioned, have a little bit of a problem with, is that all the areas are highlighted with super strong, bright yellow on every area. Instead, what we want to do is just bring down some of these highlights to a slightly lower tone, because if everything is highlighted to the same level, none of it is going to read as more reflective or brighter or having more, you know, color to it and saturation. We want to bring down some of these tones to just pop the highlights more. Like, even if we don't increase the highlights, bringing down the average is going to make the rest of the things look brighter. And right now I'm just doing like a quick paint over to kind of show you what I mean. If in some areas it's slightly darker, it's going to read as more reflective on the brighter areas. We're bringing down some of these tones, bringing down the legs, you know, even a bit more. Then we can punch the highlights on this other side even further. Oh, so we have a really nice stark contrast from left to right, and pushing these highlights even more. And if we want to punch the highlights even a bit more, here I see that you're using an ivory or a white, And if we zoom in, you can see that it becomes a little bit unclean, where it's difficult to get smooth. So it goes from like the brown to the white, and then you have these darker areas in the middle, in the smack middle of it. And when it dries, you see that it's brighter on the edges than it is on the center, because it's really difficult to make like a fully covering layer with this tone. So instead I would bring down the highlight a little bit. So maximum go to an ice yellow, but even that I would be super careful with. Mixing in the ice yellow maybe with your mid-tone. Bring down the highlights a little bit from that white. And then make sure that each one of these layers are fully covering. Now I'm not going through all of the areas, but we're just adding it to kind of showcase. So if we now look at the miniature with a quickly reshaped mini, we have more parts that are with a darker color, like more of a shadow tone, or a in between shadow and mid-tone. We've also brought down the ivory or the white that you had down to a mix between your highlight and your mid-tone, so it's like a really bright yellow. Not all the way up to ice yellow. And these small changes, just bringing down the tones, bringing down the mid-tones, having less of that, bringing up the shadows, having more shadows and less that is painted to that final highlight. Just look around this torso and chest area. When we have brightly highlighted on one side, but darker and more shadows on the other side, it really looks a lot more reflective. So this is the before, and this is the after. You can see that it reads a lot more like gold when not everything is painted to the same highlights. With that, I hope you learned something, and something to take away. Get the right gold colors, don't do too much of it. Make sure that you have fully covering layers so it doesn't look messy, and keep on painting. If you're part of the Patreon, feel free to post a mini for next month's critique in the monthly critique chat, and just have a great day. Go check out our paint set. You're probably gonna need it. Peace out, everyone. Bye bye.